So my remarks here this morning are basically by way of discussing a little bit background of accessible PDF and to set up our keynote presentation by Marco Zehe, who is sitting down here. We'll be discussing subjects related to software development or within the light of accessibility and how to achieve accessibility goals in the context of a software development effort. I'm going to talk a little bit about a new day dawning for accessible PDF, where we've come from and hopefully where we're going. So very briefly, what is accessible PDF? You've probably heard bits and pieces of this before. Perhaps you've heard the whole thing before. One of the intriguing aspects of accessibility in PDF is that everybody has a slightly different take on it. As Olaf has correctly observed more than a few times, every so-called expert on the subject has a so-called opinion. And I am not different from any of them, and probably some of my opinions are considered highly dubious by others. And it's part of the nature of the beast so far, and the way in which accessibility in PDF has evolved, that there is a substantial variety of opinions on many of the key points. Regardless, so I'm going to give you my take on it. I think it's broadly in line with the majority. First of all, it's key to recognize that the fundamental aspects of accessibility in PDF have to do with tagging the content, the real content on the page, as distinct from the non-real content on the page, artifacts, objects that have been placed there for decorative purposes or have other functional attributes, such as grid lines on a table. Nobody really wants to hear alternative text for grid lines on a table. So real content and interactive objects, annotations, form fields, and so on must be tagged in correct logical reading order. Other content should be marked as an artifact, or must be marked as an artifact. In addition to tagging content in logical reading order, it's vital that the tags reflect appropriate semantics for the content. It's not okay to tag everything as a paragraph. That makes the resulting content unnavigable to those who use devices that rely upon tags in order to help the user get around the document, or to uncover or to understand the structures that exist in the document. Oh, it's warm up here. Non-text content, images, movies, audio, and so on, must include alternative or actual text as appropriate. This is a distinction that exists far more in PDF than it does in the HTML world. In PDF, we have two different attributes for a tag. One attribute, the alt text attribute, provides the facility to include a description of the item that's tagged. The actual text attribute is simply a text replacement for that object. So, for example, an image of a word, it would be appropriately tagged with actual text, with value in the actual text attribute as opposed to in the alternative text attribute. And accordingly, that image would not be represented to an AT user as an image per se, but it would be would be represented by way of the text that's used as an actual text replacement. Natural language must be correctly identified. This is seemingly obvious, but it's also oftentimes not true in many cases. Not only at the document level, but when there are language changes within the document, these must be correctly recognized as well. Interactive features and JavaScript must not exclude or otherwise prevent successful use on the basis of a user's disability. So and the most simple and basic reason for this, or example of this, would be an unannounced change in context. It's not okay, for example, to have a situation that when the user focuses on a given form field, for example, a page change would occur. That would be an unannounced change in context, and it doesn't do the user any good at all. And when you abstract them away from where they thought they were, and you place them in some completely separate location. One of the most challenging aspects of accessibility from the point of view of developing software to help users get the job done right will be controlling for the use of color, contrast, layout, and other design qualities that prohibit users of various capacities from interacting properly with the document. The classic example of this would be instruction to press the red button. It does actually assist if somebody's quite apart from the fact that the red button is, the principal problem there would be the distinction between the red button and the green button or the blue button. These distinctions are not available, obviously, to a blind user. They're also not available in many cases to a user with color blindness. The biggest problems, however, in accessibility from the PDF point of view or not from the PDF point of view, but in general terms, are not PDF specific. And arguably the biggest single problem out there is that many authors simply don't consider document structure when they're developing a document. To the vast majority of authors, the difference between a heading and increased and a greater font size or a different font weight is in fact the difference between, because to them it's a visual representation of a heading, and so they don't understand the distinction between going ahead and tagging something with a heading versus going ahead and applying boldface and increasing the font size and so on. So many authors, so it's very difficult, of course, for any software developer to encounter a document that has a situation with different font sizes and then impute. What are you going to do? Are you going to decide that the user did not intend inline styling, that they actually intended a heading in this case? So that may be a legitimate, that may be actually true, but it may be very difficult to figure this out from studying the document. You have to, you're given the information that the author is putting in the document and very little else. So many authors happily use, as I've said, many authors happily use inline styling instead of styles that drive semantic tagging, and this is a major source of concern. This is a major source of why documents tend to be poorly structured from the point of view of accessibility needs. Even when authors use styles such as headings or lists or tables and so on, they very frequently use them incorrectly or inconsistently. A table may be used instead of a list may be used instead of a table. Well, that would be a little less usual. But there are a variety of instances where emphasis or other kinds of attributes for content are not actually handled in a way that makes it very readily possible to understand this stuff in accessibility terms. Many authors, and this is, I suppose, related, I guess it's a very similar point, but as I've been saying, the confusion between what the content looks like, between structure and style, is fundamental to the difficulty that a lot of authors have in terms of correctly expressing their content in a way that would be accessible to users who have to interact with this content through a device other than a screen, or other than a conventional desktop screen. Confusing style and semantics is routine. I've had this debate with people both, as it were, in person and online and elsewhere. It's regular. It's perfectly conventional for folks to take the view that if they've provided content, for example, that where heading levels are inappropriate to, as they see it, to a given piece of content. In other words, they feel it makes more sense in this case for a given set of content to be represented below an H3, even though an H2 tag is not present above it. They feel that the design in some other way implies the relevant degree of structure. What they fail to recognize is that so many of the assumptions they have about the way in which they read the document presume their ability to scan the document to recall that, say, particular headings had a particular color. And if a color was used to represent a given style and the author failed at some point to use H2 or H3 in that instance, the possibility of understanding the structure of that document in a structural tree context is gone. And the message to the AT user, the assistive technology user, is extremely problematic in this case. If on the one hand they've gotten used to the idea that the document includes headings, and that even if the headings proceed in a logical fashion from H1 to H2 to H3, if they now all of a sudden encounter an H6, simply because that's the styling that the user preferred in a given instance, they all of a sudden lose the ability, as it were, to trust that the rest of the headings are actually meaningful in terms of structuring the document. There are, of course, plenty of cases. Now, this is even further complicated by the fact that H6, as an example, has been used as a workaround in various cases to indicate the idea that a piece of content was important but not actually a heading. Okay, so this is actually a relatively commonplace in the HTML world. It's been explained to me that it of course can make perfect sense for a document structure to start with H1, proceed to an H2 heading, an H3 heading, and then if one sees an H6 heading occurring directly below an H3, one's not supposed to be confused by that according to many an author out there, because it obviously indicates that the H6 content is clearly below the H3 content, and it's somehow less important than the content that might otherwise be tagged as an H4. It might make sense if you have full visual access to the content, even though it might be even confusing at that level. But for sure, when you're interacting with a document by listening to the text read aloud to you, by watching, by navigating the text with a keyboard, and various other kinds of AT implementations, the legibility or the structure of the document goes away very, very rapidly, and it becomes impossible to navigate. So alternative text is another key limiting area in which content is simply not made accessible. It's a characteristic rule of accessibility that any content image needs to be represented with alternative text. That is to say, there has to be a textual equivalent to that image, or video, or movie, or audio, and so on. The vast majority of authors, number one, aren't providing alternative text in the first place, so or if they are, they do understand there's a requirement for it. They're perfectly happy to believe that that requirement amounts to the file name of the image being placed in the alternative text, which, as you might guess, is not helpful and does not represent descriptive text. So not only are many authors unaware of the need to add alternative text, but indeed they don't know, when they do know to add alternative text, they don't know what to add. And they are in the position of having to describe the image and not knowing what might be the interesting feature of it, and not knowing how to represent it in any way. One classic example of this would be as I've often told it, is the image of a firefighter standing on a hillside looking at a forest fire. There are many ways to represent that graphic. One of them would be man standing on a hill, right? But do you mention the fact that he's wearing a uniform so that he's a forest ranger? Do you mention the fact that he's observing a fire? Right? These are all questions that the average author, when they're contemplating, when they're even trying to do the job correctly, writing alternative text, the average author really doesn't know how to address that kind of question. And of course, many authoring tools don't address accessibility considerations as a particularly high priority and don't promote good practices. I won't call out, of course, any particular product. I'm thinking of a relatively popular word processor, which organizes things exclusively in terms of styles, and thus gives the user all kinds of reasons to believe that a style and structure are precisely the same question, when in fact they're really not. So accessible PDF has had a painful birth and a tough childhood. Okay? PDF, as we all know, was originally designed for the purpose of rendering. The entire reason and rationale for the original development of PDF technology was to be able to easily and accurately share a given representation of a document between users on different systems, different computing platforms, and the idea was to guarantee that they achieve the same result. That was a perfectly legitimate goal as far as it goes, but it makes things extremely complicated when it gets to the question of tagging content for accessibility purposes. It wasn't until 8 years after the original introduction of PDF in 1993 that tagged PDF became part of the PDF reference with PDF 1.4 in 2001. The relevant section of PDF 1.4, which is now ISO 32000's 14.8, were not widely adopted across the industry. And there are a variety of reasons for this. As Olaf mentioned yesterday in his presentation, the specification for tagged PDF is relatively vague. Interoperability is quite problematic. I can make a file, believe that it's accessible. You may have a very different opinion. Your software that evaluates the file may raise all kinds of questions about it that I never thought were a problem in the first place. 14.8 offers relatively little useful guidance in terms of helping a developer understand what's necessary in order to produce an accessible PDF file. The strict requirements in 14.8 are relatively few and far between. The shall requirements. They pertain to the content referring to itself. Table data cells and table header cells are necessarily or shall be part of a table structure. They're not appropriate in other tagged circumstances. That's quite useful if you're already writing tagged PDF. but if you're only paying attention to the shoulds, you're not going to achieve a great deal. There's some complexities in the way tag PDF is presented in 14.8 that make it relatively difficult, or at the very least somewhat confusing for developers who are trying to get into this and achieve good results. Let me just get rid of that. The feature I'm thinking of in particular is known as reflow. There are a variety of components within 14.8 that attributes to replacement of content in the context of tagged PDF. And these attributes are intended, at least as the text is written, to be used in a reflow implementation. There are such implementations. Characteristically, except with content that's been extremely carefully prepared, they're not particularly successful in terms of representing the content in a very highly functional way. There are other limitations to the reflow model as well. For example, it only operates on a per-page basis and doesn't address content that spans multiple pages. Other limitations are concerns with the way 14.8 is written at the present time. There are many common use cases that are not particularly well addressed in tagged PDF as it exists today. Page numbers, quite unsatisfactory to many implementers. Everybody who's grappling with this has always tried to figure out what to do about a page number on a PDF page. Should it be tagged in the logical structure? Well, that would be nice, because then the page number as printed on the page would be represented to a user who is interpreting the page through assistive technology. On the other hand, is a page number real content? Does it have a place in the flow of the text of the document? Or do you put that page number in the logical structure? Do you put it before or after the first or the last paragraph on the page? It's very hard to know. There is no good way to know the answer to that question, and 14.8 does not provide a particularly good solution. In principle, that page number, because it's created by a machine and it's placed on the page not by an author's direct intent, but by the process of simply paginating the document by the software, characteristically that should be an artifact, and indeed, with the rules of the road for accessibility say it should be an artifact. On the other hand, artifacts aren't characteristically exposed to alternative technology, and so for all practical purposes today, if that page number is an artifact, it's inaccessible. The user is instead, in order to figure out what page they might be on, they have to go check the page label for the PDF, and as we know, the page label and the actual printed page number on the physical page need not match. Let's see. A major limitation and a big part of the reason why adoption has been so slow in terms of tagged PDF is that assistive technology vendors they're not very many of them. They don't have a great deal of money, and they're extremely busy just trying to keep up with the crazy world of HTML. The world of HTML technology is far more dynamic, more fluid than the PDF world in terms of the new kinds of content and new ways of deploying it that those guys like to come up with all the time. And because, of course, surfing the web is a key value proposition for AT developers, they're in a lot of ways, naturally enough, they focus on trying to get HTML right. Paying attention to PDF, much as it is, as we know, the world's preferred electronic document format, gets second billing for AT vendors compared to dealing with HTML. Lastly, and this is true, I suppose, this is a general concern, but it's applicable very much in the PDF space as well. The PDF writers today are relying on structure information provided by the author. The difficulty is that the author can opt out of providing that information simply by generating the PDF file in a different manner. You can readily simply print the PDF and bypass whatever mechanisms are used to grab the structure from the source file and then deploy it in terms of tags in the output PDF. So the upshot of these difficulties is that since 2000, very few organizations besides Adobe, Microsoft, OpenOffice as well have done this, have brought tagged PDF creation to market. In all honesty, nobody's done it particularly well so far. There are very few instances where a file will come out of authoring software completely perfect and ready to go. And there are more recently, there are some substantial improvements in that, and in various kinds of software. InDesign, for example, does a much better job than it used to. But nonetheless, it's still the case if you ask the average person who delivers accessibility services for PDF or delivers accessible PDF, they would say, yeah, you can create this file, but generally speaking, you'll need to do a few tweaks in Acrobat before you send it out the door. And that's really not what we want to hear in terms of creating generalized solutions for accessible tagged PDF that can become part of every organization's routine document creation procedure. Anytime you hear it needs a couple of tweaks before it's done, you're thinking that's actually a really serious problem. So accessibility is hard in PDF for a variety of reasons. Number one, as I've previously said, PDF writers have accurate rendering as their primary task, and when rendering, because rendering is orthogonal to logical order and structure, that creates right from the get-go. There's a conflict in terms of the priorities that a developer would have to handle in terms of generating a file that both renders precisely as it's supposed to and handles all is correct in logical structure terms. It's not impossible in almost any case. Let me try that again. It's possible in almost every case to ensure that you get the rendering that you need and to get the logical structure that you need. It may be, however, that you have to write that PDF file in a way that you would consider to be not entirely optimal for your purposes. Where in many cases you might want to write all the text first, followed by all the images. That's going to be a problem when it comes to making sure that the content and the tags are aligned in terms of their order. PDF is extremely flexible. Consider the common features or capabilities in PDF software include all kinds of things that you could readily imagine cause extreme brain damage when it comes to handling the question of tags in PDF. Splitting, merging, and replacing pages are just probably the most common aspect of PDF manipulation that could lead, as one might imagine, to nightmares in terms of handling the structure tree. Page numbers, watermarks, and other content produce the challenge where you're adding content to a page that needs to be integrated into an existing structure tree. What are you going to do about that? Imposition, cropping, rotating pages. If you cropped a page and you eliminated some of the content, what are you going to do? You're going to go in there and have to start cleaning up the tag tree. That's an interesting problem. Existing documents, it's characteristic that the documents that a conventional flat PDF would have form fields added to it, and that also raises the subject of all those form fields need to be tagged themselves to be visible, to be usable in the logical in the tags in the logical reading order of the document, and you need to have those integrated into that logical content. You then are faced with the problem that you have a form field, you have perhaps a label for that form field that's handled in the page content. For AT users, they frequently will operate in either forms mode or they'll operate in a mode where they're simply reading the page content of the page. Quite a complex operation, in fact, to integrate the form fields directly into the logical structure and give the user a high-quality experience of the document and of the form. Interactive features such as links and buttons and JavaScript and other actions all add their own complexities. JavaScript's complexities are general. They're not just certainly for PDF, but in PDF, of course, they raise similar problems. Filling forms and digitally signing the document, more challenges there. Annotations, attaching other files, redaction is a favorite subject of the ISO 14289 committee. A subject so difficult that now some of the members routinely shy away from it when we attempt to discuss the subject of how we're going to correctly tag a PDF file so that we accurately represent the fact that content is not there. You can think about that for a second. Creating files without, and then of course there are things it's legitimate to do from a strictly PDF context that makes life extremely difficult when that PDF now needs to also be accessible, and among those would include creating files without. It's legitimate to create a file without two Unicode or embedded fonts. It's not particularly useful from an accessibility point of view, however. So at the end of the day, it's all too easy for users to simply print a PDF, ignore structured data in the source file, and crank out a PDF that renders correctly but does very, very little else correctly. And these would be among the many reasons why PDF is so difficult. So writing tagged PDF is mentally demanding. There are many challenges to the developer when they have to encounter, both from how they interact with the end user, how they deal with the actual content that user is handing them. As I've already said, writing requirements for rendering purposes tend to override writing preferences. Relatively few developers are willing to throw away all the various kinds of optimization they've already developed for PDF creation purposes. And it's no longer perhaps the fact that you really want to write your if it's a 2-column page, you really have to write across both columns. Plenty of people have written their way around that kind of challenge at this point. That used to be a major problem, perhaps less so now. It's also probably not so much the case that developers want to write out all the text associated with one font and then change to a different font and then write out all that text. That's a problem I see relatively. I used to see it a lot. Now I see it much less. But one thing that is relatively still common is the desire that is a relatively common practice is to write out all the text and then go back and write out all the images. And that's the kind of thing that can cause major headaches when it comes to producing accessible PDF files. So there are many challenging scenarios for authoring accessible PDF. When should graphics objects be grouped under a figure tag? If one attempts to give each an individual graphics object a figure tag, one would have a nightmare on one's hands very shortly. Obviously, vector graphics can involve thousands of objects. I've actually seen cases where a bar chart where every single vector in a bar chart has been given alt text by some poor user. It probably took him a couple of days, and all I could do is tell him it was completely useless and a waste of time. Instead, developers are in the situation where the user's producing a file that includes a clump of graphics objects at a particular location, and unfortunately the question has to be asked: how many figures do you have here? How many individual images need to be represented to the end user? And a similar problem: how to distinguish between content images and decorative artifacts. On the one hand, a particular photograph on a page may be a piece of content. It may represent something that really needs to be conveyed to the user because it's part of the information of the article. Another photograph, perhaps with a lower saturation, perhaps it's highly transparent, but perhaps it's not, might be completely decorative and have no purpose in terms of communicating the information of the document. And end users characteristically have to be walked through the process of determining whether or not each of these individual images in their document is in fact some content, requires alternative text or actual text, or whether it might be just an object that can be handled as an artifact. When are tables used for semantic versus layout purposes? Plenty of users enjoy the fact that their table authoring tool allows them to, for example, space content, even spaces across a page. Some other users use the tab key for the same purpose. There are many cases where you'll encounter a file and somebody's built up a so-called table using tab. So they've got, in fact, aligned columns and rows of numbers or text or whatever. From their point of view, it's a table because it looks like a table. From an assistive technology point of view, it's just a stream of text. And the developer who's helping an author produce an accessible document has the problem of attempting to figure out when they're dealing with a table and when they're not. Obviously, every time a user uses a table tool does not necessarily mean that they intend a table. How should annotations be placed in the structure tree? Annotations, they come in many shapes and sizes. A highlight annotation, that's relatively obvious. Perhaps an annotation which is a box or a circle or even a note. It can, depending upon its precise location, can be relatively unobvious in terms of where it should go in the structure tree. Page spanning logical structures create another interesting problem. Tables may span individual pages. They may span 3, 10, 15 pages. The Matterhorn protocol, which the PDF Association is just about to publish, has an 11-page table. Okay, and so that's a relatively large table, but it would make no sense at all to have it broken up. There are other more intriguing situations with page spanning structures. For example, it's possible to run text through the gutter and have text appear on one page and have the same sentence appear on the second page. It's necessary in those cases to have for one's tag to span the page boundary. That's something that reflow can't respect and requires, of course, a different set of processes by the developer as well. How do we address the question of repetitive links? Something that's a big no-no in the accessibility world is to have 15 links on the same page that all point to the same location. That's something that they're of course relatively easy to detect, but now what do you do about it? How do we handle false positive OCR? So it's vitally important when you're dealing with scanned documents. They're obviously useless to somebody who depends upon assistive technology unless they've been scanned and OCR'd, and in fact, and the OCR has to be corrected. It has to be accurate OCR. But not only does OCR have to be reasonably accurate in order for it to be comprehensible, but OCR happens in places where it's not intended. The OCR engine will frequently take a look at an image and decide that there's text inside that image, even though there isn't, or it'll decide that the border of the image includes some characters. That becomes text in the document, and if that text is tagged, then the user will encounter that text, and they have no idea necessarily that it's just garbage text created by OCR in the process of handling the page. When do we, and probably the biggest single question in many ways for people who are dealing with creating authoring software or PDF or software to develop, to employ tags after the fact, when do you force the user to fix something? When do you merely warn them? Do you force them to fix the fact that in their 300-page document they've got headings screwed up, so they might have to spend quite a few hours going back through and resolving their headings? Do you just kind of say to them, you know what, headings aren't very well structured in this document, and that's going to present a problem to people down the road? Lots of decisions that involve judgment calls about the significance of the value of a particular type of content or the representation of content. These are very difficult questions to answer on a generic basis when you're writing software. And of course, one big concern for anybody who's writing software to deal with these subjects is the fact that so many users have gotten by in terms of AT users, have gotten by for so long without tags at all. They simply scrape that content out of the document and read it in whatever order they might get it. It's one of the reasons why PDF files are so disdained by users who depend upon assistive technology. Is that characteristically, a technology is simply preceded by scraping the content stream and representing it directly. And that, of course, in many cases, depending upon the creation software, could be a completely disastrous result if the characters were written onto the page and more or less randomly, from the point of view of being sensible to the reader. And of course, you can get relatively good results that are nonetheless misleading, because while a given paragraph may be all correctly ordered, the order of paragraphs may be completely wrong. And so that document becomes completely incomprehensible for less obvious, but nonetheless but just as incomprehensible as the document that is a variety of scrambled text. One hears a lot about EPUB. EPUB, right? Compared with PDF, of course, HTML and EPUB certainly have innate advantages in terms of accessibility. So content ordering is, thank you. Yeah, well, I'm not going to beat on too much about EPUB because I'm out of time. But it's not perfect, as all of you probably know, it's not perfect for many use cases that are really important for PDF, and so, or really important for electronic documents, so we will not dwell on EPUB too much. PDF UA is the dawning of a brave new day. In 2012, the International Standard for Accessible PDF came out. And PDF UA 1, as will be discussed later on today, so I'm actually not going to dwell on it right now. I want to get to our keynote speaker, provides a variety of unambiguous technical norms clarifying the correct use of 32,000 for accessibility purposes. And more on this will be discussed later on today. In 2012, we had PDF UA was published, and immediately we started, quite frankly, to see results. Adobe announced their intention to support it. One very important AT developer, NV Access, upgraded their PDF support in NVDA. The US Library of Congress in November of last year declared that PDF UA plus PDFA is preferable to PDFA alone. In 2013, we've already seen a variety of developments that are very positive in terms of promoting accessible PDF. including a free tags-based reflow to HTML, PDF Go to HTML by Callus. iText and PDF Lib have announced support for PDF UA earlier this year as well. And next week, we'll see the shipment of VIP Reader, which is a radical new free reader for tagged PDF designed specifically for low vision users. Pack 2.0, made by shipped by Access for All, will ship in July. It's a full-scale validator for PDF UA. Crawford Technologies and others are beginning to produce production software that supports PDF UA directly for the purposes of generating high-volume print runs. The PDF UA Competence Center, a unit of the PDF Association, will be producing the Matterhorn protocol, also shipping it in July. It gives a great deal of detail and programmatic tests for developers who are seeking to implement PDF UA solutions. And there's more and more to come. So there's an awful lot of activity in the PDF UA conformance space. I have one very simple piece of advice. While screen readers are not the be-all and end-all of accessibility by any means, they can't particularly well help you with questions such as contrast. Nonetheless, it's enormously informative to acquire and understand how a screen reader interacts with your file. Obtain and learn to use NVDA as a good example. It is admittedly on Windows only at this time, but it is a fascinating piece of software, and it gives you an excellent experience into accessible PDF. So web browser developers know a lot about accessibility. It's something they encounter all the time. The browser world has many realities in common with electronic document software developers. The specification, HTML, pretty vague in certain important areas. There are a range of implementations out there. Viewers with varying goals and objectives, they have the same problem with authors as we do. It's just that their innate qualities of HTML make some of those problems a little less evident than they are in PDF. There are many substandard but kind of okay practices that happen in that world. AT users, they can be just as difficult to upgrade in that world as they are in the PDF world, of course. And but on the other hand, the browser world has many complexities we don't have to deal with. I'm not going to dwell on those right now, but they range up and down the technology spectrum, and many of these things make the problems in the PDF space seem pretty funny. So we're going to get some perspective on this from somebody who knows a great deal about these technologies. Marco Zehe is here from Marco is here from the Mozilla Corporation. Excuse me. He's been working there since 2007. Responsible for testing new features and fixes in Firefox, other products from Mozilla. And Marco has been totally blind from birth. He's been using screen readers of various shapes and sizes since 1991, when he got his first DOS-based PC. I see you like iOS now. You've been having some fun with that, which is good. And you blog at marcozehe.de. And very much like to welcome you to the PDF Association's Technical Conference. And looking forward to hearing you tell us about document accessibility for software developers. So that's it for me, and I will now hand it over to Marco.